as they innovate.
Cucumber melon, milk snow, and charred lace.
It's almost too beautiful to eat.
Hi guys, MV Movie. In this video, we will discuss a film that has been going viral recently called The Menu. This film tells the story of the fine dining experience experienced by rich people at an exclusive restaurant called Hawthorne. But unknowingly, the fine dining experience they got was completely different from the expectations of the visitors. What kind of surprises were waiting for them? But before we get to the storyline, I want to remind you, guys, that this content contains full spoilers. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on the bell, guys. Without further ado, let's get straight to the storyline. At the beginning of the film, a couple of lovers, namely Margot and Tyler, are seen sailing to a private island where an exclusive restaurant called Hawthorne is located. Tyler is a food critic by nature, so a fine dining experience at Hawthorne is one of his dreams. Unfortunately, the fine dining experience at Hawthorne cannot be enjoyed by just anyone. This experience can only be had by people who are rich and can afford to pay fantastic prices. To go to the private island, visitors must use a boat that has been prepared by the restaurant staff. Besides Margot and Tyler, there were several other guests who also attended the fine dining, including a food critic named Lillian and his editor named Ted, the wealthy couple Richard and Anne, a famous film star named George and his assistant named Felicity, and 3 successful businessmen named Soren, Dave, and Bryce. Arriving at the private island, the visitors were greeted by a waitress named Elsa. She recorded, one by one, the guests who had made reservations. However, it turned out that Margot's name was not included in the guest list. This is because Tyler has broken up with the woman he was going out with, and Margot is now his date and will replace his ex-girlfriend. After that, the guests were invited to take a tour around the island. Elsa explained that it was on the island that they cultivated quality ingredients that would be processed by the chefs. Long story short, the fine dining program finally started, and all guests were invited to sit in the places that had been prepared while watching the reliable chefs cook various dishes.
As they innovate.
Cucumber melon, milk snow, and charred lace.
A manager and head chef named Julian Slowik then introduced himself in front of every guest. He is responsible for introducing each menu that will be served as well as conveying a little message behind each of these menus. Tyler, who is a big fan of Chef Julian, of course, was touched to be able to enjoy his dish. He appears to be very excited and understands every message that Chef Julian wishes to convey through each menu.
Around the island, placed on rocks from filtered seawater, which will...
It's almost too beautiful to eat.
Margot herself is actually just an ordinary person who just goes along and accompanies Tyler, so you can see her goal there is just to eat well and be full, but like a fine dining menu, it's usually served in small portions, so Margot doesn't have much of an appetite to eat it. Apart from Margot, the other guests apparently felt the same way. They were a little disappointed because they had set expectations that were too high, but in fact the menu served was not that delicious and was even considered normal, especially when Chef Julian served several points of jam without any additional bread or condiments. This, of course, made some guests disappointed with those menus. On the next menu, Chef Julian serves a chicken thigh dish equipped with a pair of scissors. The guests began to notice that from one menu to another, the food served was getting even weirder, as was the case when Chef Julian served the tortilla menu, which instead contained the disgrace belonging to the guests. This means that before the event started, the chefs and staff had already found out everything about the guests who were present that night. Margot, who was annoyed, intended to leave the restaurant, but she was not allowed to. She also chose to calm down in the toilet while smoking. Not long after, he was visited in person by Chef Julian, who was curious as to why Margot didn't eat his dish. Impressed with indifference, Margot immediately replied that she didn't like all the menus that were served tonight. Long story short, now the guests are finally presented with the next menu. For this special menu, it was created by a deputy chef named Chef Jeremy. He created a menu entitled The Mess, or which means chaos. How the concept of the menu? Yes, in the true sense of chaos, Chef Jeremy was desperate to shoot himself in front of all the guests. The message he wanted to convey through the menu was well conveyed, because what he did manage to make the guests panic and chaos ensued. Chef Jeremy has demonstrated a very total action, so that for the success of the menu concept, he is even willing to risk his life. Because he was no longer able to bear all this, Richard intended to leave the restaurant, but instead was stopped by Elsa, who then ordered an officer to cut off one of Richard's ring fingers. What happened made the guests very scared and did not dare try to escape. When all the guests were scared, Tyler was actually very amazed by the concept created by Chef Jeremy. He looked like a psychopath who was casually enjoying a meal in a tense atmosphere. After that, Margot was called by Chef Julian. He said that Margot was a menu destroyer. Because he shouldn't have been there that night, Chef Julian personally told Margot that tonight's fine dining would end with death. He was also given 15 minutes to make a choice, whether he will die with the staff or die with the guests. Before the next menu was served, Chef Julian presented a very exciting show. He shows one of the biggest investors on the island about to be sunk into the sea. This was done because the investor intended to fire Julian and the staff because of what they had done, so Chef Julian and the staff worked together to kill him in front of the guests. 15 minutes later, Margot's time to think was up, and when she was about to make a choice, Margot finally admitted that she was actually a call girl named Erin. He'd been hired by Richard before being hired by Tyler for the night. After that, the next dish will begin. For this menu, Chef Julian handed over his position to an assistant chef named Catherine. Chef Catherine casually explained that the menu this time was inspired by her experience of being almost raped by Chef Julian. It was at that point that she finally got her revenge by attacking Chef Julian. After that incident, Catherine let the male guests flee while the female guests ate with him, and the other chefs chased and caught them all within 45 seconds.
This is fantastic. I'm fresh and maple.
Before the next dish was served, Chef Julian approached Tyler because he had the most positive response among the other guests. Chef Julian revealed that Tyler was personally invited and already knew that the event would end with everyone's death, so that means he deliberately invited Margot instead of inviting his ex-girlfriend. For his actions, Chef Julian deliberately humiliated Tyler by forcing him to cook in the kitchen and insulting his food.
You see that now, don't you?
It also made Tyler feel down until he decided to commit suicide. After that, Chef Julian asked Margot to go get a big pot, and Margot used this opportunity to sneak into Chef Julian's house. Arriving at the house, Margot was spotted by Elsa and immediately attacked. A fight ensued between them and ended with Elsa's accidental death. Margot then entered Chef Julian's room and discovered newspaper clippings from his previous job at a fast food restaurant. Apart from that, Margot also found a communication radio and used the radio to ask for help from the beach staff. Shortly thereafter, a beach official actually came to the restaurant.
What are you doing?
Bro, easy.
What kind of a disturbance?
Did anybody here call in a distress?
Radios with their meals.
What's up, Dale? Hi. Thank you so much.
For a moment, the guests were quite relieved, thinking they would be saved. However, it turns out that the beach officer is a chef in disguise.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you. Good job.
Because there was no other way out, Margot was desperate to say that she didn't like Chef Julian's cooking, the portions were too small, and the food was not delicious because it wasn't made with love. When Chef Julian asked what he wanted to eat, Margot answered, she ordered a cheeseburger and French fries. Chef Julian immediately prepared Margot's order after hearing this. Margot then took a bite and praised her cheeseburger, then asked if she could take home the rest of the burgers she hadn't eaten. Chef Julian was happy to immediately wrap food for Margot, gave her a parcel, and allowed her to leave. After leaving the restaurant, Margot also found a ship and used the ship to escape from the island. While in the restaurant, guests are served dessert with crumbs of biscuits on the floor and small robes made of marshmallows and hats made of chocolate. Chef Julian then sets fire to the restaurant and kills all the guests, staff, and himself until the end of the film. The menu is finally finished. This film shows the situation experienced by a chef who has the responsibility to always meet the satisfaction of his customers. Even though he has tried everything, many of his customers do not appreciate his work but instead focus on its flaws and criticism. So when Margot ordered a cheeseburger, the menu was very simple. Chef Julian also felt appreciated, especially when Margot seemed to be enjoying the dish and even wanted to take the leftovers home. But after all, what Chef Julian did was also not justified, guys.
Okay, I hope friends understand the storyline this time, and I'll see you in the next storyline.